Our next paper on running biomechanics is another review article by Hamill and Gruber, who are both good friends of mine, published in 2017 and titled Is Changing Foot Strike Pattern Beneficial to Runners? I screwed up here. I mentioned in our last video that that one was our last in this kind of subtopic on running economy and running biomechanics. I was going down the reading list and the numbers weren't adding up. We were going to top out at 9 running readings and there's supposed to be 10. And I looked through it. No, I skipped one and I'd skipped this one. So apologies to Hamill and Gruber. This was supposed to be reading number 4, as you can see at the top here. And so we'll make it reading number 6. That'll work well enough in our order of readings here. And this one's not all about running economy. This one touches a little bit on injury risk and variables related to injury risk. So this will be kind of our first foray into, or first direct foray into that area and the notion of running biomechanics and running injuries. Now, this concept of foot strike pattern, this is really popular and prominent in running biomechanics these days and in running in general these days, and in particular this notion of whether certain runners should change their foot strike pattern or try to change their foot strike pattern. Will they exact some benefit from that in terms of performance or in terms of injury risk? And that's really what this paper was trying to get at, is there a strong and compelling and consistent scientific basis at the moment for making recommendations that runners should try to change their strike pattern. If you are a runner and if you have your ear tuned to the running community, you probably know what strike patterns are already, but if you don't, let me give you a demonstration of them. Set our video up here. Point it at the floor. And hopefully you guys can see my feet and my shoes there. Just got my brand new Adidas today. I'm super excited about them. Haven't run in them yet, so these are brand new, fresh running shoes. The strike pattern in running is defined in several ways, but one of the most common ways to define the strike pattern in running is simply by the part of the foot that first touches the ground when you start the stance phase. And we'll typically distinguish between a heel strike, a toe strike, and something in between called a midfoot strike. Okay? A heel strike is when I finish my swing phase and I start my stance phase by having the heel first touch the ground distinctly before the front of the foot, distinctly before the toes. So my heel would hit the ground, and then I would roll forward there, and then I would push off the ground to finish my stance phase. The other extreme would be the toe strike, where my toe first hits the ground when I'm starting my stance phase, and then typically I'll kind of fall back like that as I'm proceeding through the stance phase, and my heel may or may not actually touch the ground during the stance phase, and then I would toe off the ground like that and move on to my next gait cycle. Okay. In between then would be what we would call a midfoot strike, where the heel and the toe touch the ground at approximately the same time, and the foot is roughly flat at the start of the stance phase there. Okay. So our three major foot strike patterns in running defined by the type or by the part of the foot that first touches the ground with each stance phase. A heel strike, a toe strike, or a midfoot strike. You'll sometimes see other subtle variations and distinctions between different strike patterns, and sometimes see more than 3 strike patterns defined, but those are the 3 big ones based on the part of the foot that touches the ground first. You'll sometimes also see, and I think they actually do this in this paper, at least in parts of it, see all non-rear foot strike patterns lumped together. So comparing rear foot strike versus non-rear foot strike. So combining, like, say, midfoot strike and toe strike results into a single non-rear foot strike category and comparing that to rear foot strike. One of the reasons for keeping rear foot strikes separate like that is here in section 2 of the paper, where they go on footfall pattern frequency and selection. The first part of this section here discusses several ways of determining a runner's foot strike pattern and mechanically how we distinguish between them, kind of like the example I just went over with the part of the foot that touches the ground. Beyond that, they get into how common these different foot strike patterns are. Like if you sample 100 runners, how many of them will be rear foot strikers versus toe strikers versus midfoot strikers. The numbers vary a bit depending on what study you look at and what population of runners you're looking at. But typically somewhere between like 70 to 90, maybe up to 95% of runners are observed as being natural rear foot strikers, meaning if you just send them out to run at some endurance type speed with no particular instructions on how to run, they will run, or most of them will run with a rear foot strike. The caveats there are that that's observed under what's typical modern running conditions. So typically running on a pretty hard surface like a sidewalk or a road, in a pretty soft shoe, a modern running shoe with a substantial amount of cushioning under the heel. And if you deviate from those conditions, like if people run barefoot, for example, especially on hard surfaces, or if you run in certain types of shoes, like minimalist shoes, those will sometimes encourage different strike patterns, and people will sometimes naturally use a different strike pattern under those conditions. But at least under what are typical common running conditions, running on a hard surface in a soft heel cushion shoe, the majority of people are rear foot strikers, and comparatively small fractions of midfoot strikers and toe strikers. Okay? Among elite populations of runners, like if you look at world-class long-distance runners, you tend to see larger fractions of non-rear foot strikers there, more midfoot strikers, more toe strikers. But still, even at that level, among very experienced, very talented, very competitive elite runners, still the majority of them are natural rear foot strikers in most studies. So rear foot strike is by far the most common pattern of foot striking and running. And that's one of the many motivations behind suggestions and investigations into should we change this? Should these rear foot strikers be trying to run in a different way? Should they be trying to run with a toe strike or with a midfoot strike? Okay, the three topics that they go over here are three of the main things that are suggested as a benefit in some references and some sources on changing from a rear foot strike to some other strike pattern. Those three arguments are that it's more economical to run with something other than a rear foot strike. Two, that there's a reduction in some impact characteristics of the ground reaction force that we'll talk about in a little bit when you switch from a rear foot strike. And three, that there's a reduction in injury risk when you switch from a rear foot strike to, say, a forefoot strike or a toe strike. And that's what they critically evaluate in this review. What's the base of evidence for or against those three suggested benefits from switching from a rear foot strike? In summary of that, and I wrote that down here on my summary for you guys here, if you take somebody who runs with a natural rear foot strike and have them switch to a midfoot strike or to a toe strike, doing that switch does not consistently improve running economy. It won't consistently reduce your energy cost of running. It does consistently reduce or just more broadly alter some impact characteristics of the vertical ground reaction force, which I'll go over in a little bit. And it does not, at least on average, reduce the injury risk of running. Okay? So we get a yes for number 2 here, but at least to date a no for number 1 and for number 3 here. A few things here, extra things to consider. That if your running economy doesn't immediately change when you change your strike pattern, or if you change something about your running biomechanics, it's important to consider that this was an immediate change, that this is what happened, or more specifically, what didn't happen to your running economy when you made an immediate change in your biomechanics. For example, in figure 1 here, these are some data from one of several studies that all tend to show a pretty consistent result here, where if you have somebody run with a rear foot strike pattern in the black bars here versus a forefoot strike pattern in the lighter bars here, in general, there's no consistent differences between the metabolic rate, or the rate of energy expenditure, when people run with those different strike patterns. So no major changes or major effects of changing the strike pattern on the economy of running. Okay? That's not to say that no individual benefits from picking one strike pattern or using one strike pattern or the other. Some people might get a large increase when they switch to the forefoot strike. Some people might get a large decrease, but those results vary. Some people increase, some people decrease a little, some people increase a lot, some people decrease a lot, some people don't do much of anything. So on average, you see no consistent effect there. So that's not to say that nobody benefits energetically and economy-wise from changing their strike pattern, but it's something that absolutely needs to be investigated on an individual basis. There's no consistent average effect of making that change. A thing to consider here is that, to my knowledge, and back to this notion of an immediate change, to my knowledge, all of the studies and all of the data to date on the effects of strike pattern on running economy are all what I would call short-term studies or immediate change studies, where you bring somebody into your lab, you have them run on a treadmill with the two different strike patterns, and you compare the energy cost of running it in those two different ways, or have them run with all three strike patterns and compare between those three different ways. For most of the people, one of those strike patterns that you test them at will be their preferred strike pattern, right? How they naturally normally run, and everything else you test will not be how they naturally normally run. And you might give them like a few minutes to practice it and say they're comfortable with it, but it's a pretty short amount of accommodation time. It's not really practical to have them go out and run for like years and then come back in and measure their economy when they're well practiced with it, right? Something you'll often see when humans start doing new unfamiliar movements is that we're not very efficient energetically at it when we start doing that new thing, right? And as we become more comfortable with it, more practiced with it, more skilled with it, we tend to relax our effort a little bit. We tend to have more confidence. We tend to alter the timing and control of our muscles a little bit in terms of how we do this task. And that'll often, not always, but that'll often be accompanied by a decrease in the energy cost of performing this movement successfully. So one thing to keep in mind when you see results like this, where running in the changed strike pattern did not reduce the energy cost of running, is that that's a short-term result, right? If this was a case where these rear foot strikers were switching to forefoot strike, and then on average there was no change, no increase or decrease in the energy cost of running, maybe if they kept it up, maybe if they practiced the forefoot strike for some weeks or some months or some years even, and got better at it, maybe we would see a decrease in the metabolic rate from that. Okay? So we can't really say one way or the other. I'm speculating here, and unless we have those data, we can't really say anything conclusive or definitive there. But that is something that's possible and something to consider when you see results like that. It's short-term results. They don't necessarily generalize to the long term. Okay, claim number 2 here that's often made about beneficial effects of switching from a rear foot strike to a forefoot strike is this notion of changing impact characteristics in the vertical ground reaction force. Vertical ground reaction force is shown actually in several figures throughout this paper, but first shown here in figure 2. This is the force in the vertical direction, so opposing gravity, underneath your foot during the stance phase of running. So in this graph here, the vertical force is shown on the y-axis, and the percent of the stance phase is shown on the x-axis. In the darker line is the ground reaction force in a typical rear foot strike, and in the lighter line here is a typical ground reaction force in a forefoot strike. Okay? So for the rear foot striker, you can see in their vertical ground reaction force, they have these two clear, distinct peaks in that force during the stance phase. Okay? At 0% here, their heel first hits the ground, and their ground reaction force rises up quickly to this first smaller peak here, then dips down again and starts rising up again to this bigger overall peak here. Okay, and then they finish the stance phase and toe off here and move on to the swing phase there. When you run with a forefoot strike, notice here in the lighter line, they have a kind of different looking ground reaction force, especially during this early quote-unquote impact phase in the first 15 to 20% of the stance phase or so. Here they have no distinct peak there early on in the stance phase, and they just have this overall peak here at the end, in the middle of the stance phase. That's a little bit bigger than the rear foot striking peak. Now these data, I believe, were a comparison between two different runners, between a rear foot striker and a forefoot striker. This wasn't a person running with rear foot strike and then that same person running with forefoot strike. But generally, this is conceptually similar to what you see when somebody switches. If somebody runs with a rear foot strike, they tend to have this early impact peak. If that person then runs with the forefoot strike, they tend to have a smaller peak there, a diminished peak, if not a completely absent peak, and their overall peak in the middle of the stance phase tends to be a little bit bigger. Okay. Now, why is this reduction or removal of the impact peak when you run with a forefoot strike, why is that meaningful? Well, in the biomechanics running research community, and especially early on when we first were able to measure forces like this, and this is back in like the 1970s, 1980s, when the equipment for making these measurements with good accuracy first became available. It was observed that people that heel strike have this impact peak here, and people that toe strike or midfoot strike don't have that impact peak there, at least don't have as big of a peak. Okay? So this impact peak was initially a concern, largely because it happens so quick after the foot hits the ground. So it rises up real fast here from basically no force up to a pretty substantial force. Sometimes this impact peak can be 2.5, maybe even 3 times your body weight if you're running quickly. So it's smaller than the overall peak here, but it's still a pretty substantial force under the foot at that time. The concern here was that because it's rising up to that peak so fast, because that force is rising up so fast and is being applied to the body so quickly, that there may not be time for muscles to adequately respond to that increase in force. This happens over like, I don't know, 30, 40, 50 milliseconds or so. So pretty fast. It rises up from 0 up to this peak pretty fast. And there may not be time in that short little tens of milliseconds window for muscles to adequately respond and coordinate themselves to position the body in a way that's safe to handle the consequences of that force. So the thought here was that this impact peak may result in potentially deleterious loading of passive structures of the body, cartilage and ligaments and bones and things like that, because the muscles can't respond quickly enough to react to it. Okay. That leads into topic number 3 here, which is later on in the paper when we get to section 5, so the third topic, but the 5th section of the paper. The initial idea here early on in the running biomechanics world was that when we measure these impact forces, and if these forces are injurious, we could then develop ways of running, such as switching your strike pattern, or develop footwear, such as shoes with special design or special cushioning, that would diminish that peak or minimize that peak. And then we won't get injured, since we think these impact peaks are a major source of running injury, and we won't have as many injury problems with runners, and everybody can run as much as they want and get all the health benefits of running, and everything will be great. Turns out that there's not actually a strong, consistent relationship between the characteristics of this impact part of the ground reaction force and the risk for developing running-related injuries. And this is one of those things there where if you look in the literature on this topic on features of ground reaction forces and risk for running injuries, you will indeed see some studies that say having a higher impact peak versus a lower peak is a risk for injury. You will indeed see some that say having a higher rate of loading of that impact peak versus a lower rate here is a risk for injury. You can find multiple studies in the literature that show that result. You can also find just as many and typically more studies in the literature that don't show that result, that don't show a relationship between impact peak and injury, or between the loading rate of that impact peak and injury. So overall, if you, at the moment at least, combine the results of all studies on this topic, there's no clear, consistent relationship between running with different strike patterns and injury risk, and running with different characteristics of the ground reaction force and injury risk. So it's too early, certainly at this stage, to make any strong conclusions on which strike pattern is best for minimizing injury risk. There is a little bit of evidence if you look more specifically into the injury research. One thing that we like to do, for better or worse, in injury research in running is kind of lump all injuries together, which I think is a little bit misleading a lot of the time. It's highly unlikely that all injuries have the same mechanism underlying them, or that there's a biomechanical signature of injury-prone runners regardless of what injury they develop. I think there's probably different biomechanics associated with different injuries for sure. But what you do see if you compare Runners who naturally use different strike patterns, like natural rear foot strikers versus natural toe strikers, is that overall they have about the same risk of injury in most studies, but they have different risks for different types of injuries. Like you can find studies showing that forefoot strikers or toe strikers have a higher risk of like ankle and foot and toe injuries, and rear foot strikers have a higher risk of knee injuries, okay, for example. So while changing your strike pattern may not necessarily reduce your injury risk overall, it can certainly affect your injury risk of particular injuries. So if you have like a heel striker and they just constantly are getting knee injuries all the time, maybe they ought to try switching to a forefoot strike. Or if you have a forefoot strike and they just can't stop getting Achilles tendonitis, maybe they should try switching to a midfoot strike or to a rear foot strike. So it could certainly affect the risk for certain types of injuries, even if it doesn't affect the risk for overall injuries. Another part related to that I wanted to mention here, and just to finish up on this one, are these last two bullet points here. And let's get it back onto performance here for running, but especially in running, performance and injuries are kind of intimately tied together, because performance in running is really largely about having long-term consistent blocks of training, which requires avoiding injury, right? You can't train effectively and can't put in a lot of miles and a lot of workouts if you're constantly getting injured and can't run. So not to say that running biomechanics aren't important for performance. We just spent the last week talking about how running biomechanics can affect economy and how that could feasibly affect performance. But a lot of the time, I think the equally important factor, and maybe the more important factor, is just your training consistency. Even if maybe your biomechanics aren't the best in the world, you can become a pretty good runner. It can at least make some pretty serious improvements with long-term consistent training, which requires avoiding injury. So again, avoiding specific types of injury. If you have somebody that uses a certain strike pattern and is constantly getting hurt, well, maybe try using a different strike pattern and see if now they're not constantly getting hurt. Will that immediately improve their performance by making this short-term immediate change in biomechanics? Probably not, right? It's not going to necessarily, at least on average, make this sudden consistent change in, say, their running economy that's going to make them suddenly faster the next time they go out and do a race. That's not going to happen in most people. But what it might feasibly let you do is avoid injury in the long term and train more consistently or in higher volumes and in higher intensities without getting injured as much, and through that improving your fitness and improving your performance through that. So these things are kind of intimately tied together in running biomechanics and in sport in general. We can talk about performance and we can talk about injury as if these things are separate, but really they're pretty tightly coupled together in a lot of cases, and especially in the case of endurance running. Okay, that is it for today. We will see you next time.